During the winter of 1978 to 79, when I was a young trooper in the Canadian Armed Forces Militia, South Alberta Light Horse in Edmonton, I took a non-trade driver's course conducted by the 15 Edmonton Service Battalion. The Canadian Armed Forces has a driver's licensing system separate from the various provincial systems in Canada, and a driver of military vehicles must have a military driver's license called a 404 and pass a road test for each individual vehicle they're going to drive in the Canadian Armed Forces. After completing this non-trade driver's course and some additional training that summer at the Militia Area Prairie Training Center in Dundurn, Saskatchewan, I qualified as a militia armored crewman with a trade qualification of TQ1. During my military driver's training and later on during my service with the militia, my favorite vehicle to drive was the Duce and a half. This being the case, I remustered from the SALH to the 15 Edmonton Service Battalion and changed my trade from armored crewman to MSE Op, or Mobile Support Equipment Operator. When I served in the Canadian Armed Forces in the late 1970s and very early 1980s, the militia used the GMC M135 2.5-ton 6x6 truck, which had the nickname Duce and a half. The M135 was in production from 1951 to about 1955 and saw extensive service with the U.S. Army in Korea, but was superseded by the M35 shortly after. Canada, on the other hand, used the M135 from 1951 until well into the late 1980s. So by the time I was driving this type of Duce in the late 1970s and very early 80s, these trucks were going into their third decade of service. The Canadian M135 Duces had 6 wheels, all with single wheels, unlike most other military trucks that used dual wheels on the rear. They also were unique in that they had an automatic transmission with a control handle located on a tower beside the driver. The transmission had 4 speeds and 2 ranges, with high range only engaging the 4 rear wheels for use on normal roadways, and the low range engaging all 6 wheels for use cross-country. The transmission control tower also had the starting handle for the vehicle located on its right side. To start the truck, you switched on the ignition switch located on the dash, then pulled the starter handle. The truck was also capable of fording rivers and streams. To do so, the engine air tank under the hood would be closed and this one on the dash would be opened, and the truck could ford water up to this level. The M135 Duce and a half utilized drum brakes on all 6 wheels and had an air-over hydraulic braking system in which high-pressure air was used to enhance the hydraulic pressure used to engage the brakes, basically like the powered brake system on a passenger car. If you lost air pressure, let's just say things got interesting in a hurry. You still had hydraulic brakes, but without air pressure boosting it, they were so hard to engage that they were next to useless. One time I was driving in a military convoy just to the west of Lloydminster, heading back to Edmonton from Dundurn, when the vehicle in front of me slowed down, so I had to brake as well. And all of a sudden, the Duce and a half behind me roared past me on the shoulder, honking its horn like a crazy thing. Apparently he had lost his air, and he was only able to stop the vehicle 100 feet ahead of me on the shoulder of the highway. Luckily, no one got hurt, and there was no damage to any of the vehicles. I bet you in that cab there were some wide eyes and quite possibly some brown pants. Since I had such fond memories of driving the Duce and a halfs during my service in the militia over 45 years ago, I wanted a scale model of the Duce and a half, and that turned into a bit of an adventure as well. Finding a scale model of the GMC M135 was not the least bit easy and took over a year to find. The M135 was primarily used by Canada, and so the various model manufacturers don't consider the demand for it large enough to make a scale model of it. There are scale plastic models of the Duce and a half used in World War II, but that's not what I was looking for. After an extensive search on Google, Amazon, eBay, and Etsy, I found 3 model manufacturers that had the M135 in their lineup, but each had their problems as well. The first kit model manufacturer I came across with the M135 Duce and a half in their product line was ASAM Models, located in England, that manufactured white metal model kits of various types of trucks and military equipment. The owners of the business, Alan Smith and Alan Simpson, were gentlemen in their 80s and were in the process of shutting down the business. I contacted them by email and was told they had made model kits of the M135 in the past, but were out of stock of them, and due to shutting down the business, didn't anticipate making more. According to ASAM's website, the business will cease trading on March 31st, 2026 and sell off all their equipment and molds at that time. So maybe someone will manufacture models with their molds of the M135 at some future date. But for now, this source for the M135 Duce and a half is gone. The next model kit manufacturer with the M135 Duce and a half in their product line is Triglyph Models, located in the country of Slovenia in Eastern Europe. They offer resin kits of the M135 Duce in 1 to 72, 1 to 48, and 1 to 35 scale. I have never built a resin model kit before, and I was unsure how easy it would be to ship a kit from Slovenia to Canada, but I strongly considered this option to get a model of the M135 Duce anyways, and may purchase one of these kits sometime in the future. Finally, Hart Models used to have a die-cast model of the M135 Duce and a half, but it had been discontinued. I was checking out eBay one evening when I noticed that someone had put up one of these die-cast models of the M135 Duce for sale. I put this eBay entry on my watch list, and a day or so later I received an offer to buy the model at a $52 US reduced price. I put in a counter offer for $7 US more off, which was accepted, and so my search was over, and my model was shipped to me from the southern United States.
Days later.
Now that the little truck has arrived, let's take a closer look and see what we've got. The little Duce and a half is in okay condition and matches the photos in the eBay seller's listing. It is most definitely an American Army version of the M135 Duce, as seen by the large white stars on the door and hood. The rear view mirrors on both sides of the Duce have been bent inwards and are the smaller round ones that were originally installed on the M135s in the 1950s. By the time I was driving Duce and a halfs in the 1970s, they had switched over to large rectangular mirrors, which, though better, still made it hard to spot a vehicle right beside the truck. The cab roof on my little Duce is the removable canvas one found on the American version. The Canadian version was a hardtop, as removing the roof is not practical in the far colder Canadian climate. The side stakes on the truck bed have come detached. I'll have to glue them back in place. The top of the exhaust stack has been bent over. I'll have to try to bend it back and hopefully not break it. The exhaust stack has also been painted black and olive green. It should be a dull steel color or possibly a rusty brown, as paint would not stick to the stack due to the heat generated by the exhaust, and thus they were left unpainted. Also on the cab, there should be a small window just behind the door on both sides of the cab. Now that the little Duce and a half is here, let's go get to work and convert it from a very American Duce and a half to a Canadian version that I remember driving during my service in the Canadian Armed Forces Militia in the late 1970s and very early 1980s. I didn't want to strip the paint off the little Duce, as it is a suitable color for a Canadian Duce in the time period I wanted to recreate. But I did want to get rid of the American Army markings, hopefully without wrecking the paint while doing so. I googled how to remove decals and learned there were ways to do this using paint thinner, nail polish remover, or the method I chose to use, rubbing alcohol. Using a Q-tip, I applied the rubbing alcohol to the decal. As the decal softened, I then used my fingernails to start scraping off the decal. By repeatedly applying a small amount of rubbing alcohol with the Q-tip and scraping away with my fingernail, I eventually was able to remove all the American Army markings from my little Duce. This method worked great, and the underlying paint was not damaged. Not having the white stars and other quite obvious US markings goes a long way towards converting this little Duce to a Canadian version. I need to do some work on the cab roof to convert it from an American soft top to a Canadian hard top, and I had planned to remove the cab from the frame to do so. I had spotted a screw under the cab on the underframe, but when I removed the screw, the cab didn't budge. I decided the safest course of action to prevent damage to the little Duce and preserve the paint was to leave the cab attached while I did my work on the roof. On the passenger side, I carefully straightened out the bent over exhaust stack, then removed it. Due to the heat of the exhaust passing through the stack, paint would not adhere to it, so they were left unpainted. After a while, they kind of turned a rusty brown, and there was black at the top of the stack where the exhaust passed through. I painted the exhaust stack with steel-colored Testors enamel paint. After that dried, I painted some light brown paint I had over it, wiping off most of the brown paint, leaving a steel exhaust stack with blotches of brown, indicating that it had started to rust. Turning back to the cab, one of the most obvious details showing that this Duce had a canvas roof was this rope detail. To protect the paint, I applied some masking tape to the cab and body of the Duce. Then got to work filing down the rope detail. To touch up the area I had filed down to remove the rope detail, I used Tester's flat olive paint with a bit of black mixed in to more closely match the body color of my little Duce. By the 1970s, the small round rear-view mirrors on Canadian Duces had been replaced by these large rectangular ones. But for the sake of convenience, I decided to use the older style round ones already on my Duce model. On the hard-top M135 Duces used by Canada, there were small windows just behind the doors on the cab. If I'd been able to remove the cab from my model without risking excessive damage to the model, I would have tried to add these little windows. But I decided the risk outweighed the benefit, so my model will lack this detail. I wanted it to be obvious that my little Duce and a half was a Canadian one, so I decorated it to somewhat match this photo, starting with the license plate. Vehicles owned by the Canadian Armed Forces are registered separate from all the provincial registration systems and use Canada plates so that military vehicles can be operated and be transferred between provinces as needed by the military. During my time in the militia in the late 1970s and very early 80s, the number on the plate was divided into two parts. The first two digits designated the year the vehicle came in service, and the following digits were the vehicle's number. So in the case of this plate, the number indicates that the vehicle entered service in 1951 and is vehicle 872. I also decided to add this logo to the doors of my Duce. In 1968, the Liberal government of Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, in one of its dopier schemes, disbanded the Army, Navy, and Air Force and combined them under one entity, the Canadian Armed Forces, and came up with this logo. Me and my buddies nicknamed it the Tri-Force Pineapple due to its resemblance to the tropical fruit. Using the Paint app on my computer, I reduced the size of the images of the Tri-Force badge and the Canada license plate until I got something the right size for my little Duce and a half. Then printed it out on glossy photo paper. The images were right at the limit before blurring completely out, but you can still read Canada on the license plates and see detail on the Tri-Force badge. Time to install the Canada license plates on my little Duce and a half. They are out of scale and way too large, but anything smaller printed on my computer system would just be a blur. So I'm going to live with slightly too large license plates. Rooty tooty, good and fruity. Time to get the Tri-Force pineapples on the doors. My little M135 Duce and a half has now been maple washed and is a Canadian version of this military vehicle. When I transferred to the service battalion in the late fall of 1979, I was 19 years old and the youngest guy in the unit. I was also the only one who didn't smoke, so I got assigned the POL truck. POL stands for Petrol, Oil, and Lubricants. 45 years ago, the only sign attached to the truck signifying that I had petroleum products on board were these flammable placards attached to the side stakes of the truck box, which didn't inform emergency response personnel what was being transported in the truck in the case of an accident. In 1985, 3 years after I left the military, Canadian Armed Forces vehicles hauling hazardous goods began following transport of dangerous good legislation and mounted TDG placards. But that was after my time, so I didn't include a TDG plaque on my little Duce model. To load my little Duce and a half POL truck, I used two 45-gallon oil drums and a whole lot of jerry cans from a Tamiya detail kit and loaded it up to match a diagram in my Army notebook from my MSE Op TQ2 course in 1980. The truck was loaded with the heaviest items at the rear over the axles and the lightest items towards the front of the truck. Therefore, the very heavy 45-gallon oil drums were right at the back, and the jerry cans of MT80 gasoline are in front of them. When I issued out jerry cans of gasoline, they were exchanged for one empty jerry can returned for every full one issued, and the empties were placed at the front of the full ones. My little Duce and a half POL truck has now taken up a place of honor in my home. Working on this video on my favorite vehicle during my service with the Canadian Armed Forces Militia 45 years ago brought back many happy memories. Till next time, everyone keep safe and well.